My name is Pierre Strasser. I work at Activism, and I will be the facilitator on behalf of Responsible of these 6 webinars of our webinar series. I'm going to start sharing the screen, and then we'll see what we are here for and what is on the table in this webinar. First, why the webinars? In Responsible, we started to work on ocean literacy a few years ago. Clearly, it's, as we had said in the earlier webinars, it's a new term, but a term that covers elements on which many of you have been working in recent years: awareness raising, capacity building, education, sometimes science policy interface. This term is coming from the US, and as indicated in the slides, we had 2 projects, Sea Change and our project Responsible, that work on these issues for the last 3-4 years. Important in the work that we do is the importance of strengthening the link between knowledge creators on one side and users of knowledge, be it policymakers, children, citizen consumers, or business sectors. And that has been the main attention of our projects and project activities. The objective of the webinar series is sharing views, challenges, best practices on ocean literacy, progressively try to bring people on the community of ocean literacy in Europe and wider, and then progressively identifying on one side policy recommendation and on the other side areas that require further work. And that's some elements we'll touch upon in the webinar today. For people that were attending some earlier webinars, we talked about education, literacy for children. We had webinars dealing with consumers on one side or economic operators, specific focus on blue growth and how ocean literacy needed to be fine-tuned to ensure blue growth is sustainable. And the webinar today will in particular discuss on the effectiveness of the different ocean literacy initiatives and how we can best capture effectiveness and ensure that when we embark on ocean literacy initiatives, we do a good job and it is useful for something. As said earlier, the outcome of the webinars leads to key messages and recommendations, with some inputs to policy making, research, education, marine policy also, and part of it will feed into the conference that we will be organizing on March 18th to 21st. I will go back to it at the end of the webinars because that will be a key milestone in the work that we do on ocean literacy and wider on supporting effective ocean governance in Europe and beyond. A few words about the Zoom platform. All participants are muted except ourselves acting as host and the different speakers. You can still use the chat button to ask questions. All participants will receive your questions, your comments, your input that you can provide during the webinars. And you can also use question and answer button that we moderate. Only hosts and panelists will see it, but not other participants. And we'll try to make sure that we can, at some steps of the webinars, provide some answers to the question that you raised. The webinar number 6, as I said, it's about effectiveness. The title is Think, Hope, Change, Assessing Effectiveness of Ocean Literacy Tools, with 3 questions we propose to address. The first one links to the right level of ocean literacy. We'll go back to it a bit later, in particular with some input from your side as webinar participants. The second question is, how do we measure that we are successful, effective, when we do ocean literacy initiatives? And the third questions that we will address at the end of the webinar relates to the need to consider what we need to consider when we measure effectiveness of ocean literacy initiatives. 3 simple questions, and to provide answers to these 3 questions, we have with us today 6 persons around the table. In particular, 4 are around the table in Plymouth, as you can see from the, you might see later from some of the pictures. I will start with people that are not part of the responsible group. First, Sabine. Sabine is specialized in psychology and sustainability, addressing in particular issues of behavior in relation to plastic litter. Fiona, who has been our co-worker for some years in the Sea Change project. She was the project manager of Sea Change, and she was a co-developer of the European Marine Science Educators Association. And then Gillian, who is the head of the School of Marine Science at the University of Plymouth. And she is particularly interested in science policy interface and the link between people's activities and impact on marine ecosystem and ocean waters. From the responsible group, we have first Matthew. Matthew is, in fact, the person that has organized this webinar, and he has worked with us on assessing effectiveness of the tools and products that we developed. He's accompanied by Louise, who is working at Oceanopolis Aquarium in Brest, and she has been developing and testing tools in the context of responsible. And then finally, Owen, who is lecturer in computer science in Ireland, Galway, and has worked in responsible on the knowledge system and on the ocean literacy tools development. My introductory job stops now. I'm going to give the floor now to Matthew, who will accompany us throughout the seminars, my role being more of a facilitation and animation of the webinar itself. Matthew, floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Pierre, and welcome to the webinar. I just want to introduce what we'll be talking about today. So obviously the concept of ocean literacy has been well established, particularly the principles and the fundamental objectives and concepts and the 7 pillars of ocean literacy. And that's been moved into a lot of education curriculums and practices where it could be moved into building knowledge, especially of younger people. In the Responseable project, as if you explore some of the earlier webinars or viewed those, then ocean literacy has been taken to look specifically at 6 key stories or 6 key marine issues. Within those issues, the actual system of the causes, the effects of those issues, and the responses that actors, people, general public, industry and policymakers can take at different levels to reduce those problems or eliminate them. So essentially the actors are provided with the knowledge of responses, and the ocean literacy tools that have been developed in the project focus on those. If I just move to the next slide. We had to show you that there's a lot of campaigns that people, I'm sure, are very familiar with seeing in social media and the press, which based around explaining the link between the ocean and people and the importance of acting. But necessarily this is awareness raising areas, and the question we'll be looking at a lot today is actually looking at the third concept of an ocean literate person, that they make informed and responsible decisions regarding the ocean and its resources. So if we just move to the next slide, I think we have a quick poll for anyone on the webinar today, just to ask you how you'd rate your own level of ocean literacy. So over to Pierre and Olga to set that for you. Okay, so there's a number of options there. So if you'd like to take a quick 1 minute and just sort of decide which of those most refers to you. How would you rate your own level of ocean literacy from none to you already know everything and there's nothing left to know?
What other things? Average, good, excellent. I already know everything. There is I can't read the last bit. Okay, that's 30 seconds. Who puts that? What would be interesting to see is, does this tell us how many people are out there?
I think maybe we can go ahead. I think we have a very good group of ocean literate people. I think we might have all our own ideas of why we think we are or are not ocean literate. And clearly when we started to work in Responsible, we often realized that, in fact, indeed, people knew quite a bit about the ocean ecosystem itself, much less about the link between human activities and the ocean, and sometimes not very much about how change in their own behavior could impact directly or indirectly the ocean. Matthew?
Okay, thank you, Pierre. And I think on the next slide might be moving to a panel discussion, or to investigate sort of what the right level of ocean literacy is. So in this question, I might just hand over to ask a couple of the panel here. But so one's a question about sort of in people's own work or experience. What do they feel the right level of ocean literacy is, and how can you, does it depend on the role of the person? Does it depend on the situation you're in, or does it depend on the topic being considered? So I'd like to sort of open the discussion up first to Fiona from Sea Change.
That's so kind. That's because I'm sitting next to you. No, yeah, it's an interesting question. What is the right level? I don't think there is a right level, but I certainly feel it does depend on the actors. So whether we're looking at within a formal education or policymakers or the general public. So if you look in the Ocean Literacy Toolkit against the SDG 14 for education there, they've got like 3 levels of learning. There's sort of 5 categories within there. And part of that is cognitive learning, and then social economic, and then also behaviour change. So, and if you think the sort of students that we have now are those that are going to come into the science with us moving into the decade of ocean science, they're going to be the people working on that. So you'd like to think that a high level of ocean literacy could be introduced to our students. But if you're looking at policymakers, it might be a case of what they need to know at that time, and if they have a bill of ocean literacy or concerning maybe a certain area, so they're working in maritime fisheries, and they have more, just not just the knowledge but more of an understanding, then that could, you could have far more effective meetings and what's going on. For the public, if I meet someone and the public has even dipped their toes in the ocean, then I think that's brilliant, and that all comes down to people's feelings and attitudes and values. If they know that oxygen the ocean provides us oxygen, I think that's fantastic. So there's kind of so many levels of what we want, depending on who you are and what you're doing. And I think just with, as we were saying, Blue Planet 2 and what's happening with plastics, you know, there's sort of that increase in people wanting to know about the ocean and maybe act. So there isn't one easy answer, obviously, but it does depend where people are at that time and what can happen in the future.
And possibly through raising awareness and raising knowledge, that then people can look for the further information on the behaviours that they should be doing to address the topic, and so that's the basis of it. And
there's so many channels that people find information, and I think what is really important when it comes to the whole ocean literacy piece is that people are provided by accurate scientific knowledge. You know, like the Pacific garbage patch is not a ginormous floating island of litter. You know, so, and also I think we have to be very aware when we're sort of promoting ocean literacy and about the ocean that we bring in a bit of ocean optimism. I'm going a bit, you know, so that whole sort of values and behaviour change discussion
can be addressed. And I know Louise, that you've done quite a lot of work with interviews with ocean literacy or very ocean literate people, such as the Zero Waste Commission you've mentioned to me before. I don't know if you have any thoughts you'd quickly like to share on that topic.
Yeah, well, I guess there's something that that we really noticed while doing these interviews. We did 9 interviews, mainly on plastics, but 2 on fishing as well, fisheries, and of professionals within the value chain of that issue, and of scientists or people kind of exterior observance. And what we got on where they learned, how they became ocean literate is basically they all had a million things step by step that added on. So they have these vivid recollections of during COP21 I saw a documentary on this issue, and so then I dug into it a little bit, and then I got integrated into a Facebook group and I saw a debate, and then I saw this, and then I went and did something else, and then they went to a conference, and you know, it all just builds up, which I guess would go into that of, I don't know if there's a right level of ocean literacy. You just need to be able to spike someone's interest to kind of have them jump down the rabbit hole. Yeah.
There's another factor there as well as the level of ocean literacy, but also their motivation.
Yeah, well, I mean, some people, it's a very emotional connection. I mean, we had people talk about their childhood and memories of distant places or who knows what. And others, it's much more practical. As I was riding the metro and I saw this number in front of me, and all of a sudden I thought, oh my gosh, what am I doing? I need to change. And I mean, it can be very different things that will bring people in to becoming curious and open to becoming ocean literate.
Thanks, Louise. And I think if there are any other thoughts from the panel, or should we move on to the next? Okay, there's just a couple of slides to move on from that discussion. To look at is awareness and knowledge enough? So it's very interesting from Fiona that there's different levels of awareness and knowledge, and that's a building block. And that there's also from Louise's point that for those people that become very animated and very sort of influential ocean literacy professionals in their own actions, there's often an emotional connection perhaps, or other motivating factors. So looking at that end goal that people appreciate the effects of their actions and undertake behaviours to reduce the impacts that they're mal-informed and that they take responsible decisions, it's possible that we're assessing other factors, not just awareness and knowledge in ocean literacy, although the very basic building blocks of ocean literacy are based on that knowledge, and there's a lot of very good assessment of that through the International Ocean Literacy Survey and some of the work developed under some of the other projects on ocean literacy that are very relevant for that. I'm just going to go to another panel discussion, and just on the next slide, if first of all, if we just have a quick poll of the audience just to see what possibly drives your behaviour So the next question, just to try to think about when you've undertaken an ocean literate behaviour or environmentally responsible behaviour, what do you think might have, in your own case, has driven that behaviour? So the options are, do you know about the issue? Or if you know about the issue, are you worried, concerned about the issue? Do you believe that it brings benefits from taking the action, so that's why the main reason that you do it? Do you just feel it's socially correct and that it's something that you should be doing and seem to be doing? Or it's important that everyone's doing it together? Or do you essentially just worry about what the direct effects would be on you, on your health or your income? So just a quick sort of 30 seconds to choose one of those off your own experience.
Timing again. Let's put more questions up. It's got 18 participants.
I'd say clearly the question and the options you have in the pool are quite general. And the socially correct, it might be because my mother thinks is the right things to do, or my grandmother, or colleagues, or wider society, etc. And you might have also, and we hope it emerge from some of the discussions, other reasons and factors that drives you to change or not to change. We have 9 votes so far. I don't know if I stop the poll or I wait for a minute. Maybe the people that didn't vote is because they didn't find the right option into what we suggested as a list. It's coming. We get there. I think I will stop the poll and then maybe share with the group. So people are, when they are worried, maybe also what do you mean by being worried and concerned? It may also be different dimension that we might touch upon in this. What you realize is that I know about an issue is clearly not the main elements that you find. Matthew, I give you back the floor.
Okay, thank you very much for your answers. And yes, we can see the overwhelming winner there is in red, I am worried or concerned about the issue. So obviously that sort of attitude of concern or just worrying about the impacts on the environment and yourself is definitely there. And then possibly influencing that as well is that people do vote for I know about the issue, but it's only 40%, and also 40% believing that it brings benefits from taking the action. And much smaller is you feel it's socially correct. And also 10% is that people are very worried about how it will directly affect them, their health, their income, etc. So on the next slide, we'll just go to, so we're lucky enough to have Sabina here. It's a lot of experience in not only psychology and assessing the influence of factors of behaviour change, but looking at how sustainable and environmentally responsible behaviours are sort of influenced and how to assess those from a psychological sciences point of view. I'd like to just invite Sabina and then the other panellists to answer the question, sort of what's worked well for the assessment of effectiveness of ocean literacy or education of initiatives. Is knowledge enough to lead to behaviour change, and what else could be measured or should be considered when people are looking at these issues?
Thank you, Matthew. Yeah, those are interesting questions and not that straightforward to answer. So what has worked well? The first thing I want to say, it depends on what you're targeting, because I mean, you can measure knowledge. There are tests with which you can measure knowledge. And you can get an answer to how well your knowledge, your awareness raising campaign has worked. So if your interest is, if your goal is to increase knowledge, you can use those tests. if we want to be a bit broader and we actually want to change behavior, that's much more tricky. And there are various ways of measuring behavior, including self-report, which is relatively cheap, relatively straightforward, but there are certain biases to people reporting behavior. They might be motivated to exaggerate what they're doing to look good, or they might not even be that aware of what they're doing. It's actually quite difficult to get good data on behavior. And from my point of view, in an ideal world, I would always like to see objective, observable data. So any way of measuring that would be the gold standard. But we have done many studies where that's just not possible. It's quite difficult. So I realize the limitations of that. So that's my answer to the first question. The second question, I think from everything people have said already, we all agree. We haven't just talked about knowledge when we discussed earlier. We also already talked about emotion. We talked about personal experience. And I think it's important to not think about ocean literacy as a narrow knowledge concept, because when I look at the behavior change literature, there are many, many determinants of behavior. And knowledge is one determinant, it's one factor, but it's by far not the biggest. There are many other things that actually facilitate behavior that are much more important. And I just want to give you an example to illustrate this. If you think about health behaviors, we all know what we should be doing. We should be exercising, we should be eating healthy food, and yet it doesn't really happen. And I think the same discrepancy can be seen in this area. So just to pick up a few things, emotions came out earlier. Emotions can be independent from knowledge. You know, someone might see a very powerful image of a turtle choking on plastics, and that might lead to this emotional reaction going, oh my God, that's just wrong. I feel really sad about it, or I feel angry about it. Both those pathways have been shown in psychological work. And then they immediately go to action. Even if perhaps they haven't got knowledge at that stage, maybe they go and seek knowledge. So it's interesting to think about those processes. Social norms have been shown to be very important. And if you think about, for example, education campaigns, they can be very powerfully established social norms. So that's another way how, you know, an education campaign might be targeting knowledge, but what actually happens is you talk to a group, you talk to a school or something, and then you have that social norm, and that might be the main driver. And there are other things. Perceived control is a really important predictor of behavior. If you're aware of an issue, you might have a lot of knowledge, but you feel there's nothing at all I can do. That's actually really bad. That's really negative. People might just give up. They might become defensive. They say it's nothing to do with me. But there are many different other predictors. The other thing that was mentioned earlier already is this connectedness to nature or connectedness to the ocean, which is also has been shown in some research to be a powerful driver. So if we feel it's got something to do with us, it's not an abstract topic somewhere out there in the Pacific, something bad happens. It's got to be linked to our experience, what we care about, our values. So that's the second question. But I don't think anyone on this webinar really disagrees from what I've heard.
What else? Yeah, we were wondering also what else might be need to be measured, but I think you've covered a lot of those. There's a lot of very sort of, I guess, not necessarily diverse dimensions, but there's a lot of dimensions to possibly looking at the end goal of people making environmentally responsible decisions and reaching those behaviour change objectives that was particularly identified in the key stories in Responseable and relate to a lot of the wider principles of ocean literacy as well. And I know I'd just quickly like to ask Fiona as well, because I know with the Sea Change project and also a lot of experience with over 20 years, I believe, as a marine educator as well, that you may be able to sort of shed some light as well on what you've seen sort of has led to possibly assessment of behaviour change and effectiveness.
Well, yeah, I mean, the behaviour change is always tricky, and I think part of Sea Change was looking at how we can change behaviour, and there's a big document that you can download off the Sea Change website, which was conducted by Christine Donegan in National University of Ireland in Galway, looking at values and behaviour change. And you kind of summarises, it's going to take a long time to change people's behaviours and how you assess it. And so we did a lot of that, and I think that is always developing. It was, first started in the C for Society project, and then that's developed into Sea Change, and there's another project, Sophie project. So we're kind of doing that through MC. MC has been great. We have an annual conference. This year it's in the Azores. Yeah. In September, so right in the middle, well, not right in the middle, but in the Pacific, and so it's interesting how we've heard presentations from a lot of people around Europe, how I think people sort of changing the way, there are a lot of educators and changing the way they teach. And it's one little example we did through that for the Field Studies Council in the UK. They have a lot of students that come, and we were looking at just changing how they phrase things. So there was a couple of questions like, how do you feel will have an impact on the ocean? And then training the people that were teaching them to not only do the surveys of periwinkles, but also bring in more conversation about the ocean and attitudes. And actually then when they were asked the same question again, the replies they had, there was a lot more variety, and also the way they verbalised it, the words they used were different as well. So kind of, there's lots of things, and I think through Sea Change and what we've been doing with different initiatives, people are looking at different ways and taking ocean literacy, as we've said, a lot, much further than knowledge, because we realise knowledge is not.
Yeah, it sounds like there's it's kind of the concept of assessing the effectiveness of these initiatives is sort of hopefully being sold as a benefit to planning them, knowing that they're being effective. But it sounds like there's a lot of, obviously, dimensions. There's a lot of different ways of going about that, and there's lots of potential things that can be found out, particularly with people's emotional reaction to things and the knowledge and the language they're using. So I don't know if there's any other people who want to quickly comment on that, or if we should move on to the approach and responsible.
I just had maybe a reactions to what Sabine said, because initially we start with a definition of ocean literacy that is very much about knowing to be in a position to act and change behavior. And in what you said, Sabine, I wonder whether in our definition we miss a bit the dimension of ocean literacy being a collective process that helps changing social norms in a certain way. So it's very different from the definition we have at the beginning, but maybe ideas, food for thought to give a more dynamic and collective process dimension into the definition itself.
Yeah, sorry.
I think that's a really interesting thought, and in fact it's one thing that behavior change approaches have been criticized for quite severely, because critics say the behavior change focuses on the individual dimension, so totally ignores any social processes going around, and I don't think that's true at all. When you look at behavior change, they're very aware of this embeddedness in society, and there are also constraints on what you can do. So I think that criticism is overplayed, but by including that in your definition, awareness that the social processes are really important, I think you're showing that you're going beyond the narrow sense of behavior change. I really like the idea.
Can I say? I just say that seems to sort of tie in, actually, having the social processes. When I was listening to it, and we were talking about what level of knowledge is necessary, I think that the knowledge that's necessary is really about the system of the oceans. It's not about anything specific. It's about the fact that the oceans are a system of which we are part, and how we therefore can influence them, and as a society. And so it's sort of like linking those systems rather than getting into knowledge and knowing things like what the animals are or whatever it is. It's very much, it's a much sort of broader topic that we're trying to address. I think
Knowledge is like, well, so what?
Yes, exactly. Whereas the system, knowing you're part of that system, then that's what really, and you and society can influence that system. That's what really matters.
And it also matters
for the good or bad.
Yeah, because it all interlinks, because what we've seen in the past is that people, and I mostly talk about plastics, sorry, people think about one aspect of the system and they're looking for the miracle polymer because it'll solve all problems, but then we don't know how that's used. We don't know any other, side effects, other unintended consequences. We really need to think about it as, there might be a technical solution within the context of what it does to the ocean and what people decide to do and what they want to do and so on. I totally agree. Yeah.
It's great to have the wider perspective as well. So got ahead of ourselves, but on the next slide, I think we can, I'll just sort of summarise the approach to Responseable, and slightly relieved that hopefully it sort of goes on some of the guidelines and some of the discussion we just had. But as we mentioned with Responseable, there are many different tools or ocean literacy initiatives developed around these 6 key topics. The picture below is just one of a cartoon which promotes at the end of the cartoon, explains the system, explains the cause and the effects, but then shows a response that people can take to hopefully start addressing the issue. And the idea is to, in the assessment, we looked at those final objectives of each of the tools, for instance, this final scene from the microplastics cartoon, but then we also looked at the indicators of, or predictors of behaviour change, or those stages that people, the behavioural sciences literature recognises people go through to support an environmentally responsible behaviour. So we identified key topics of initial awareness, developing knowledge. It's interesting the discussion whether it's very detailed knowledge about the topic itself or just the general knowledge about how humans impact the oceans, how the oceans benefit us, and about the environment and the ecology or the chemistry of the oceans as well. So many concepts there. And then looking at those attitude questions, the idea of concern or belief in benefits, and looking at that sort of social norm, or for this project we chose, because we had limited time to do before and after surveys, we looked at just an issue about communication. So if people are talking more about an issue amongst their peer group or their family or people at work, or even sharing information on social media perhaps, then that's an influence. It's becoming more of a possibly social norm, or possibly moving into that kind of analysis, but there's a lot more detailed work can be done on that, leading to behaviour change. So on the next slide, we just sort of introduce that there are many tools in Responseable, as I mentioned, and to try and document those stages and to identify how each stage can be reached, looked at the theory of change logic model, which it's been used a lot in conservation projects where people are looking how to increase sort of support for a marine protected area, for instance, or even in businesses where you're starting up a business and you're trying to identify how to get to the stage you want to be at in a couple of years, and you go back through the stages that you'd have to go through to reach that. But it made a very easy step to communicate how the assessment would work for each tool, and also to identify with the people developing the tools what we were designing and how the different stages would be reached. And if you look in the earlier webinars, there's a lot of information on the drivers, activities, pressures, state, impact, welfare, and response models that were used to look in those individual key stories. So on the next slide, we just highlight the response. So we basically use questionnaire approaches. So asking the participants or the people, or whether they're attending one of the courses to do a tool, or whether they were viewing a film, to complete a survey before. Then they'd have interaction with the tool, or they'd attend the course, and then after that, repeat the survey. This might be slightly different tenses in some of the questions, but essentially the same questions. And it was mostly looking at the participants' self-reported levels of awareness, their knowledge, or their self-reported knowledge. We've talked a lot about objective knowledge and being able to look at other measures of that as well. Their concern of the effects of the impacts, their attitude towards their belief in benefits, frequency of their communication, and also frequency of either currently taking behaviours that are identified as the objectives of those tools. And for most of the tools, unfortunately, it's just their intention in the future of taking those actions. But I'll just quickly go on to the next slide. I think this one. Just hand over quickly to Owen, because obviously we did that assessment I just talked about with a couple of tools, but also Owen and Connor at the National University of Ireland and Galway also looked further at that knowledge area and looked at some objective assessments of knowledge using quiz-based questions and ocean literacy survey-based questions, and also then link those to attitude and behaviour change questions. So Owen, if you'd like to introduce that work, please. I'm sorry, I think we need to go back one slide.
I think I'm unmuted now, am I? I don't know, I think I am.
Yes, yeah, you'll be okay.
Thank you. Yeah, we surveyed 180 students here who had absolutely no knowledge of ocean topics, really, ostensibly at all. And we did some analysis on that work. And it was very interesting because we chose quite narrow topics. So we chose like sustainable fisheries for one survey, coastal tourism, marine litter, and so on. And like a lot of surveys in the environmental and ocean literacy areas, we found that there was weak to no correlation between knowledge and attitude and behavior, but a very strong correlation between attitude and behavior. And so that was very interesting. And I think it kind of it throws up an interesting problem that we see with the assessing the effectiveness of the ocean literacy tools, is that where you have a tool which is designed to increase literacy or knowledge on a specific topic, it's difficult to establish a correlation between that and actual behavior change or attitude change. Going back to the problem of knowledge, which I think was mentioned a few minutes ago, clearly there are different types of knowledge: awareness about its topic, knowing about a subject, or being able to explain a subject. And we see great scope for that systems type of perspective that Gillian mentioned earlier on, the ability to understand and explain what's actually happening to other people. And I think one of the key multiplier effects possibly that we should certainly pay more attention to is the communication dimension of ocean literacy. In a kind of a socially media connected world, what is the multiplier effect of giving people knowledge and getting them to engage on a subject and communicate about it and explain it? So yeah, it's very interesting, the work we've done. I think we need to do a lot more on trying to tease out the different levels of knowledge. I think just using the term knowledge isn't sufficient. I think we need to break knowledge down into different types of knowledge to get a better understanding of how that interacts with attitude and communication and leads to behavior change, if indeed it does. Thanks, Pierre. Okay.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, and the next slide, I just I think there's been one comment relating to the
sorry,
the last slide.
Just when the exciting bit comes up, the data, I just wanted to add one thing, and which you just raised. You know, we're a bit skeptical about just knowledge, but knowledge about practical things that you can do is incredibly important. So it's that sort of really pragmatic level. I just wanted to add that.
Well, thank you.
So when you're saying knowledge about facts about the ocean is one thing, but knowledge about what.
That's really handy for moving on to next slide. So just so Owen sort of did some very detailed research within the university there, and this is just some of the results presented from the actual kind of use of the tools developed in Responseable on sort of the intended groups that were being used. So applying that kind of that theory of change logic model, applying the surveys before and after. So this first example is a group of 11 to 15-year-olds who attended an event at the National Marine Aquarium in Plymouth in the UK here. The event was actually for 2 to 3 days or more. On the first day, and it's part of an ocean club, a teen club event that the aquarium runs. The first day, they'd actually do the survey. And then during that day, they were also shown, or after doing the survey, they were showing the film Rethinking Plastic, which is available on the Responseable website. And then after viewing the film, or at the end of the day, the course leaders at the aquarium also gave some time for them to repeat the survey. And so the results on the right there, so I've just got very brief sort of allusions to the questions, but for the first two knowledge questions before the before answers in white and the after answers in grey, I actually see quite a significant increase in, so I'm afraid it's probably possibly missing at the bottom there, but increase in agreement that their level of knowledge on the effects of marine life, or the effects of microplastics and plastics on marine life has increased. Their self-reported knowledge on the effects that the effects of microplastics in the marine environment may ultimately have on human health had increased. But interestingly enough, the attitude questions about what their concern was and their initial belief in benefits and their concern about microplastics in particular were also very high before the course. And similarly, they remained high or increased to a very small amount. And see sort of similar moderate levels of communication and moderate levels for and high levels for looking at actual behaviours that they could do generally to reduce those environmental issues. So looking at recycling, and at the bottom there, separating plastics for recycling, and looking at plastic project, they already were moderately supporting those behaviours already. But when we look at the ones with significant changes, they're looking for products without microplastics, supporting shops that don't sell microplastics, and supporting campaigns that's actually behaviours that are identified in the film and were quoted by the film. So the results are interesting here in the fact that the film seems to be effective in increasing knowledge, and particularly knowledge, as Sabina just mentioned there, about actions that they could take to reduce those impacts. But what's also interesting is this seems to be a group of participants or students that are already quite highly motivated, and also you can accept that they would possibly motivated because they'd gone to an aquarium in their own free time in the school holidays to be part of a course to learn more about the marine environment. But also sort of it looks at the effects of these tools on people that already have quite a high environmental concern, and that they actually seem to be gaining something. And I'll just move on to the next example before I bring up the limitations as well. So the next example was the same approach, doing surveys before and after interaction with a tool. This time the tool was a course over 2 days on, it's entitled Sustainable Shipping. So it gave a broader picture of the marine environment and how shipping interacts with the marine environment. But particularly was focused on the topic of invasive species transported in ballast water. The group was, I think the youngest were at 16 and the oldest were in their late 20s, and they're all training in a technical college to be either engineers or deck officers, so navigators and sort of bridge officers on ships that would either be container ships working from port to port, or very large fishing boats and merchant boats that were offshore for a long period of time and travelling around the world. And in this group, we see similar. Good. We see an increase in before and after responses, our support for their level of awareness, their support for the behaviours. But what's interesting here is also a change in attitude and significant change, particularly in concern for the effects of invasive species. And then also relating to the very last one, their self-reported intention to undertake actions to reduce the spread and impacts of invasive species. But what was interesting again was the feedback from this course. When another question on the form was sort of what they enjoyed about the course, what they'd learnt, and one of the factors the students replied they enjoyed was that as engineering students or technical students, they didn't get taught about background ecology. They didn't know about plankton as particularly kind of the wealth of life, or the sort of food webs and how plankton will support life in the ocean. And also about how the effects of different marine larvae as they move around the ocean. So they actually found that really interesting to learn about that wider concept. So that systems area that Owen and Jill have both mentioned really seemed to actually kind of come to play in that course. And also what was quite interesting as well is these students did mention, or at least a couple of them, that what do they do if they want to undertake a behaviour? They don't want to take the ballast water out within a harbour. They want to follow the guidelines and make sure it's done far out to sea. Or they want their ship to have the most up-to-date equipment to deal with this. But what happens if their officer doesn't, their captain doesn't, the company they work for doesn't? And so they point out a very sort of interesting point that there was a great opportunity to to develop this area of knowledge and the knowledge of the behaviours people could do and the background system to this group of students, or this group of sort of young professionals as they would be now. But perhaps there's a need also to approach the rest of the industry, from the company owners, the ship owners, and the sort of experienced officers and captains. So that was something that sort of brought home from doing that. But just for sort of move on to another discussion area is just some of the limitations. Obviously, you've mentioned that these were just before and after surveys, and the surveys we did afterwards were just generally asking intended behaviour of people. I'm trying to follow up where I can with, especially the shipping course students, to find out if they've been able to undertake behaviours they wanted to, and if their attitudes were still the same now we're moving on to at least sort of 6 months or more after that course. But they were intended behaviours, and we weren't able to necessarily measure objectively what they were doing and how frequently they were doing it in a way that wasn't sort of self-reported. So, as Sabina mentioned, this is quite an area that I think could be developed within assessment of ocean literacy and other education tools. But I think our final kind of discussion is sort of based around that, sort of what else needs to be considered when measuring effectiveness of ocean literacy initiatives. Are the other contributing factors influencing people's behaviours that we need to consider, and then also just look at what the challenges have been when we've been trying to do this in practice and what solutions we found, and then to come up with some take-home messages, sort of how we can best apply or what best practice for assessment in the future and how it can benefit ocean literacy and sort of policy areas. So I know it's very broad, and I know we only have sort of 10 minutes or so to do this, but if I hand over to Pierre, perhaps to start the discussion, and then to invite some people who are interested to speak on it. So.
Great data. He's there.
Oh, hello.
Okay, perhaps as everyone's in the room with me, and I know Sabine, you have to go very soon, are there any sort of take-home messages or ways to sort of develop assessment of the ocean literacy initiatives?
I'm in two minds about it, because the key thing I want to say, the approaches we're using now, I think, are very useful. Questionnaire tools, self-report tools are very useful because they give us an idea about what's out there. What are people thinking? Does it change? With all the limitations we've mentioned, but they're still very useful. I think a before-after comparison is very useful, even if there's no control group. Because as an experimentalist myself, of course, in an ideal world, we've got another group. We don't know what's going on in the background. Has Blue Planet just been played on the TV? So it's really useful to have a control group as well. But I think what we're doing at the moment is already great. So I really am not critical. But I would also say we can be ambitious and work towards better methods in the future, attract the funding that will fund those better methods, because we're constantly scrabbling around trying to do things on a minimum budget. So I just want to say, let's not beat ourselves up about where we are. I think it's all great. I really like seeing the data. But let's also say, well, we can do things even better and sort of be ambitious about it. I think that's what I want to say.
Thank you, Sabina, for how to improve these areas. And from anyone else's experience with practical ocean literacy tools and assessing them, are there some possibly sort of messages on the challenges and how to take home? I know perhaps Louise has done quite a lot in Oceanopolis and across France. I know in Paris and in Brest, and experienced this. Have there been any specific challenges, and how sort of can we deal with those?
Yeah, I think the first challenge we faced was when dealing with assessing the ocean literacy of children, was adapting the vocabulary we used and the phrase structure, sentence structure with teachers. And it took us a lot more time than we thought. It took us weeks to get to something that teachers of various levels thought would be adapted to their students. And that's something that I think we don't always have enough time to do, but that radically changes things, because on 5 classes or something, we only had one student who circled a word and said, "I don't understand it." And I think in our earlier versions, we would have had all of the questions that would be like that. And then in terms of methods as well, having done the interviews, is we realized that different things came up, and so if ever it is possible, as Sabine said, to have more funding or something to be able to take more time to do things. I think having more qualitative research on what makes people change could also be interesting to try to have the both in parallel.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I felt as well, what I want to do at the moment is to be able to follow up with those groups and to find out, sort of, as I mentioned, sort of ways of approaching them and finding out if they've been able to undertake behaviours and what the barriers were, and then be able to do that conceptually with different groups using the tools at different stages. And then, obviously, that's a long-term view and an ideal situation when the work can be undertaken.
Yeah.
Thanks. Owen, do you have any thoughts from the work in?
Yeah, I think that from the work we've done and what we're learning about ocean literacy and the different dimensions of ocean literacy, I think when it comes to interventions, it's probably a good thing to be very clear about what you were trying to do. And are you targeting attitude? Are you targeting communication? Are you targeting behavior? Rather than kind of very broad initiatives which are just targeting ocean literacy in general. For example, in the commercial world, I don't think people will be trying to increase people's knowledge of very broad areas, but they'll be looking for specific results, specific to achieve specific end goals. And I think that's okay. I think it's okay to mix a little bit of activism with science from time to time. But the other thing I think in the terms of broad ocean literacy, from what I can see, the systems knowledge, really being able to understand and communicate about things, is probably something that needs to happen at a quite young age. Yeah, and it's certainly it's not evident in the education system here, that ability to understand systems and think about them and explain them and transfer that knowledge from one system to another, you know, and that seems to be lacking. Because there's in the media in the last couple of days, it's the Irish farmers are being faced with alternative facts. It's now dangerous to eat red meat, and cows are not good for the planet. They knew that all along, but now they have to accept that. Whereas I think people need to be able to train to deal with systems and knowledge and understanding how things work. It's to embrace the complexity of systems effectively. That's my little speech on that.
Yeah, it seems very like the place, especially all the work that's been done sort of on developing curriculums and developing ocean literacy within education systems is the building block for this, hopefully. And then if tools and ideas can be generated as issues approach or appear, and look at those specific attitudes and behaviours that need to be adopted to address those, and people already have that basic behaviour, perhaps, or basic understanding and knowledge, that sounds like a fantastic way to go. And I think there's an interesting study I read where people have very extreme views about something, and I think in the study their self-reported knowledge was very high, but their objective knowledge actually turned out to be a lot lower than their self-reported knowledge. So to be able to have that basis of the knowledge, especially around those pillars of ocean literacy, seems essential. But then to be able to adapt those the knowledge that people need for behaviours to address certain topics, it needs to be added to that. So I'm not sure. Do we need to wrap up now, Pierre, with any final thoughts?
Can I just say a quick thing, because through MC and first went to National Marine Educators Association, our friends who developed the ocean literacy principles in the States, and then that kind of came into Europe and got into the Galway statement. And I just think, just sitting here, it's just been brilliant how it's gone from the concept in the United States, and then we've had the money from the EU through Sea Change and Responsible, and how we've just developed the whole idea and concept and how, about ocean literacy, and we've taken it further from, what it was in the States to fit it into the curriculum, and now it's sort of created this just really amazing conversation about attitudes and how we get to that behaviour change. So I just, you know, over the last 6 or 7 years or something, it's just been really interesting, and the work you've done with Responsible has been, you know, it's really interesting, and how we develop that further. And you know, so Responsible's coming to an end very soon, Sea Change coming to an end, and how can we take this momentum forward and build that into a systems approach and get some funding. So I just think it's really cool.
We should be optimistic.
Ocean optimism. Ocean literally optimism. That's what I say.
Okay, thanks.
I think effectively, Matthew, we need to slowly move to the end. And let's say it's a 3:02. If I don't go back, I think Fiona raised one of the issue. Let's say how you internalize some of the dimension we worked on specifically to some other initiative activities. How do we try to make sure that it continues to live and there are instruments that can do it? From our side, the next step that will be an easy one is the conference or the event that we co-organized with the Marina Project. Marina Project is a project that worked on responsible research and innovation. So we are all working around the way knowledge is produced, shared, and help to change attitude, to change behavior at the end. So what we could do at that stage is to invite people that attend the webinar to come and participate in this event, as much in contributing, but also to come and see or present how some tools, products are developed, how is effectiveness assessed, and whether we can go a bit further with some of the key lessons. So the conference, the event will take place 18 and 20 March in Brussels, and the event itself is supported by the Commission clearly, but also by the European Parliament and by UNESCO. I received a decade for ocean science, so we hope that it is one of the instruments that will help us to bring a few stones and ideas in the processes of others that will carry work, thinking and activities beyond what is the end of our own project. I want to maybe thank all the participants. Sabine left already. Thanks in particular Matthew for the role, the organization, the facilitation. The webinar has been recorded, and we will do specific summaries of the key messages that arise from the webinar itself, bringing it to the conference, the event that we organize in Brussels in March. Before we stop, thanks for your contributions, panelists, and for people that attended the seminar. Please fill the short survey when you leave the webinars, because that's always help us to develop, continue to work on these issues, including in the format of webinars. So thanks a lot. Matthew, I think it's okay from your side. Any more words you want to say?
No, I'd just like to reiterate the thanks to everyone, especially the people that have joined today in the webinar, and the panelists as well for coming in and discussing their experiences. And I'm sure if the people do have any questions and need to follow up, that we'll try and get back to you, or you can find us through Responseable and the project. Okay, thank you very much.
Enjoy the end of the day, and hope we see some of you in Brussels in March. Bye-bye.